Right, so chapter 14 is going to look at the Civil War itself, but as with any other war we look at in this course, we really don't focus an awful lot on the fighting of the war or troop movements or generals or battles or anything like that. Instead, we're concerned with the general course of the war and the cultural and social and political changes that are happening on the home front and their consequences for later. Number one is asking why the Civil War is considered the first modern war. There are a number of reasons for this. One is the new use of industrial technology and weaponry that's going to result in extreme casualties that haven't really been seen in prior wars, but will be a hallmark for wars moving forward. So, this means making use of things like railroads, the telegraph, more accurate firearms, etc., to enable armies to be more effective in killing the enemy. Almost as many people died in the Civil War as in all other US wars combined. And a sobering statistic here is that 25% of men who left the fight in the war never returned. So that's 1 in 4 men who left the fight never actually came home. And this casualty or really death rate is exacerbated or made worse by poor medical care of the time, which enabled greater infection and spread of disease and made otherwise non-fatal wounds fatal ones in the long run. Another characteristic that makes this a modern war is that there were fewer distinctions between soldiers and civilians, meaning that there was a higher civilian death toll. Another reason it's a modern war is that the ability to mobilize economic resources was central to the war effort for both sides. This is not a war that is primarily won on the battlefield, but rather it is primarily won by mobilizing your economic resources to supply your armies, to move your armies, and any other resources necessary. In comparing the combatants side by side, the North and the South, or the Union and the Confederacy, at first glance it appears that the North, or the Union, has every imaginable advantage pretty much. They have a higher population, in fact, something like 2.5 times that of the South. That means more soldiers to fight and more people to stay back home as workers agriculturally or industrially to supply those soldiers. They have a much greater manufacturing capability than the South. In fact, 9 times that of the South. That means they're better able to supply their troops. And this is a long term consequence of the North industrializing and diversifying their economy during the market revolution, whereas the South simply did not do that. Looking at this map, it is also clear that the Union or the North had far more extensive railroads, making it easier to move troops and supplies. And they also had greater financial resources, meaning that they had better ability to invest in war infrastructure, to fund the army, to fund manufacture of goods, and so on. Now, on the other hand, the South does have some advantages, but these tend to be a little bit less concrete. So, one advantage is that the South or the Confederacy only needed to hold out against invasion and conquest. In other words, they're fighting a defensive war. There's no necessity for the South to invade the North, to take the capital, or anything like that. They simply have to hold out long enough for the Union to tire of the war and agree to sign a treaty that recognizes their independence. In that respect, it's an awful lot like the Revolutionary War. They're trying to become an independent nation. They just have to hold out long enough to have that independence recognized. So in the Revolutionary War, we did not have to go conquer England or take over London in order for us to become independent. We simply had to fight long enough, hold out long enough for the British to effectively give up. Another advantage that the Confederacy enjoys is that they have highly motivated fighters, certainly at the beginning of the war, who felt that they were defending their homes, their families, and their way of life, particularly their white supremacist slave society in which they lived, even if they didn't own slaves themselves. Now, on both sides, the war stirred feelings of intense patriotism. But that's really characteristic of the early days of the war. As the war dragged on, those feelings tended to wane quite a bit, which led both sides to institute a draft. Um, this is the first time in US history that we've had a draft or compelling men into military service. It begins with the Confederacy having a draft, the Union follows suit, and both sides have provisions that allow you to get out of the draft based on your socioeconomic status. Really, if you are wealthy or relatively wealthy, you are able to avoid the draft, which leads to the expression that the Civil War was a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. So in the South, they had something called the 20 Negro provision, which exempted one white male for every 20 slaves on their plantation. Very few Southerners owned that many slaves, meaning that this was a very upper crust elite that was exempt from the draft effectively. In the North, you could pay a $300 draft substitution fee, meaning that you pay $300 instead of getting drafted. They'll use that money to recruit somebody else. No one has $300 unless they are very, or well, pretty wealthy. Your average Northerner that would like to avoid the draft simply does not have $300. So again, soldiers on both sides were referring to this war as a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight, based on this ability to avoid the draft if you had enough money to do so. Now, like I said at the beginning, we won't focus that much on battles, but we will mention some consequential ones in the early days of the war versus the latter days of the war. So the only battles that you probably need to know, and even at that, they probably won't end up on the exam. The only battles you need to know from the early days of the war are first, the Battle of Bull Run in 1861. This was an early Union effort to take the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, but it failed. And not only did it fail, but the Union engaged in a chaotic retreat, more of a rout where they're really just sent running than they are a controlled withdrawal. And there's high casualty rates on both sides. And it convinces both the Union and the Confederacy that the war would neither be short nor would it be relatively bloodless. Both sides expected that this war wouldn't be that costly and it wouldn't take that long. This war shatters that illusion altogether. Or excuse me, this battle shatters that illusion altogether. The other one is the Battle of Antietam in 1862. Here, the Union repels a Confederate invasion of the North, and again, probably an unnecessary effort to invade the North, but nonetheless, the Union repels it. There are massive casualties on both sides. And in fact, the number of casualties, meaning dead, wounded, and missing, in this one battle was more than all other American wars in the 1800s combined, both before and after the Civil War. What's important about this battle is that it does two things. One, the Union victory helped to persuade England and France to stay out of the war because the South had hoped for diplomatic recognition or even assistance from either of those two countries because they were so dependent on Southern cotton. The Confederacy referred to this as cotton diplomacy, the idea that the world's reliance on Southern cotton would lead other nations, particularly Britain and France, to side with them in the war and give them an advantage. The other consequential outcome of this battle at Antietam is that it persuaded Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which is an executive order that sort of symbolically freed slaves. We'll talk more about that here in a moment, but it is a consequential document and a symbolic turning point of the war, to say the least. Question two, how did a war to preserve the Union become a war to end slavery? So Lincoln initially insisted that the war was one to preserve the Union or keep the nation together rather than to abolish slavery. And that matches up with his personal position and the position of the Republican Party back in the 1860 election, which is we are anti-slavery in the sense we don't want slavery to expand westward, but we are not abolitionists because we will continue to allow it to exist in states that are already slave states, like in the South. Um, Lincoln actually says at the opening days of the war, he says, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do it because I believe it helps to save the Union." So clearly, his primary concern is keeping the country together. Slavery, at least in the opening days of the war for him, is very much secondary to that purpose. In fact, 6 days before he wrote this, Lincoln had met with a delegation of African American leaders, and he encouraged them to persuade their communities to leave the United States and migrate to Liberia. And in that meeting, he actually blamed the presence of African Americans in the United States for the war. That they should leave because African Americans could never, quote, be placed on an equality with the white race. And he told them to sacrifice something of your current comfort, and that to refuse would be extremely selfish. Next, Lincoln felt the need to hold on to the border states. These were the states of Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland, and Missouri. These four states were slave states, but they had not actually left the Union. So, in an effort to hold on to them, Lincoln engages in certain practices that are not necessarily above board. So, one, he suspended habeas corpus he suspended habeas corpus in the border states, which habeas corpus is a constitutional provision that says you need to actually charge someone with a crime to arrest them. So suspending habeas corpus allows Lincoln to arrest opponents to the war without them actually having violated any kind of law. Furthermore, he instituted martial law in Maryland, which seemed important because Washington, D.C. is stuck right between Maryland and Virginia. Virginia is already part of the Confederacy. To allow for Maryland to go Confederate would be to have the Union capital completely surrounded by Confederate territory, which couldn't be allowed. And in Kentucky, Lincoln turned a blind eye to a significant black market of smuggling and Confederate sympathizers, saying, quote, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." Because to lose Kentucky would mean to lose, or rather grant, a significant amount of manufacturing to the South. If Kentucky had gone to the Confederacy, it would have done something like nearly double the manufacturing capability of the South. And Lincoln certainly did not want that because Northern manufacturing was certainly an advantage that they enjoyed over the South. At the same time, Lincoln doesn't want to lose the support of conservative Northerners who are not abolitionists and maybe not even anti-slavery. And it's really important to understand that not everyone in the North opposed slavery and supported the war. Lincoln faced significant opposition. Even by the time the war is over with, it doesn't enjoy overwhelming support. Now, regardless of the way Lincoln sees things and the way Lincoln is portraying things, slaves recognized this war for what it was. It was a war that could result in their emancipation. And they began to abandon plantations in mass and head toward Union lines or Union soldiers for protection. And this severely hampered the operating capability of Southern estates and thus the Southern economy. And Union troops could actually take or seize slaves as contraband or illegal goods of war, according to a set of laws passed called the Confiscation Acts. And this was important because it weakened the Southern economy and thus their ability to wage the war. So before the Emancipation Proclamation, before the 13th Amendment, before the conclusion of the war itself, slavery as an institution is deteriorating because of the actions of slaves themselves. Radical Republicans in the North, though, are pushing to make this a war that is explicitly about abolishing slavery. So radical Republicans are strong opponents of slavery within the Republican Party, and they are in Congress pushing for a law or a constitutional amendment that would emancipate slaves and end the institution once and for all. The first big step toward that is the Emancipation Proclamation, which again is issued as an executive order after the Union victory at the Battle of Antietam. That said, it's more of a symbolic document than anything else. And that's because it only quote unquote freed slaves that were in areas of rebellion. So the Emancipation Proclamation did not free slaves in the border states, nor did it free slaves in Confederate territory that the Union was controlling. So the border states you already know, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, slavery is still legal there. And in any territory that has these vertical lines on it, this is territory that is part of the Confederacy, but has been conquered by the Union effectively. Slavery is still allowed there. So he had the ability to free, excuse me, I'll say it this way. He didn't free slaves where he had the ability to free them, and then claimed to free slaves where he didn't have the ability to enforce that. So just because he said slavery is illegal doesn't mean Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and so on are getting rid of slaves. They're not, because they see themselves an independent nation, not subject to Lincoln's executive orders. So this is a symbolic document, and slavery as an institution will not legally end until the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. We'll do more on that later. That said, the Emancipation Proclamation is not an inconsequential document. It is important because it first fundamentally changed the meaning of the war. It went from one to preserve the Union, now to end slavery, and thus the war becomes something greater. It becomes a kind of moral crusade, and in doing that, it strengthens the Union's morale and it's the moral cause of their efforts altogether. Also, as we've already stated after the Battle of Antietam, this Emancipation Proclamation is important because it convinces England and France to withhold their support for the Confederacy. Keep in mind, both of these nations had already abolished slavery years before, and they were not about to side with a nation that was fighting to preserve an institution that they had already at least legally declared to be immoral. Another consequential effect of the Emancipation Proclamation is that it allowed for African Americans to serve in the Union Army, and over 200,000 would eventually serve, playing a crucial role in the war. In fact, in the later days of the war, Lincoln credits the Union victory to these troops in particular. Now, at first, most of these troops served in roles performing manual labor, and this was due to prevailing racial prejudices that was skeptical of African Americans' ability to fight in a soldierly capacity and relegated them only to menial tasks and manual labor. But they will certainly later serve with great distinction. For example, the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers, who are, by the way, the subject of a very good movie called Glory, won a lot of commendations for their battle at Fort Wagner. But the 54th Massachusetts and Glory is a really good example of things. It's worth your time to watch because it shows a number of things. That African Americans, first of all, were not allowed to rise to the rank of a commissioned officer, which very much limited their ability or their mobility within the Army. They were also paid lower wages for much of the war, despite doing the same kinds of jobs, obviously, and performing the same kinds of roles. Arguably, this helped to dispel some prejudice, and their service in the war led to greater calls for the right to vote for African American men. Question 3, how did the Civil War transform the national economy and create a stronger nation state? Worth noting here is that the size and power of the government typically grows during wartime or a perceived time of crisis. This is true during the Civil War. It'll expand again during World War I and World War II. And although it's not a war in the traditional sense, the government greatly expanded again during the Cold War. And you'll see this happen, and I'll remind you of this in later eras when we get to it. But in this context, the bottom line is that Lincoln uses his presidency and the war to transform the United States into a powerful nation state rather than a kind of collaboration of states. It becomes more unified as a single nation than a union of states. There's an upsurge of nationalism during the war. It's kind of an extreme form of patriotism marked by a feeling of the superiority of your country and its interests over others. And for Republicans, at least, criticism of the war became akin to treason, which is part of the reason that Lincoln suspended habeas corpus in the border states, is so that he could silence such critics. And much of this focus was on so-called Copperheads. Copperheads is a name given to Northern Democrats who were advocating for peace, advocating for negotiating a peace treaty with the Confederacy that would end the war, but it would also recognize the independence of the Confederate States of America. So these people were considered akin to traitors from a Republican point of view, and they were oftentimes the targets of arrest without charge, which is allowed by the fact that Lincoln had suspended the writ of habeas corpus in border states where you were more likely to have Copperheads or Northern Democrats. Next, the Northern economy grew dramatically during the war. Manufacturing boomed to supply the war effort, and so did farming. And there was lots of government investment to try to facilitate this and encourage this to happen a bit quicker. One example of that is the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act was part of the Republican platform or their statement of goals and beliefs in the 1860 election. And the Homestead Act encouraged westward expansion by giving 160 acres of effectively free land to anyone who agreed to settle out west. The only money you had to spend was a filing fee. That's it. So you were expected to develop this land over 5 years in order to keep it, and that's going to encourage a lot of people to move westward. The problem is a lot of these folks have no idea how to farm. They're not farmers themselves. They're usually moving from urban areas out to rural areas in the West to try to farm. So Congress also passes the Land Grant College Act, also known as the Morrill Land Grant Act. And this gave money to states to assist them in establishing agricultural and mechanical colleges to help educate people in how to farm so that they could develop this land in 5 years so that they could hold on to it. The Republican controlled Congress also invested in the economy by chartering two corporations, the Union Pacific Railroad and the Central Pacific Railroad, and they were contracted with building a transcontinental railroad to connect East and West. Again, this was part of the 1860 Republican platform. Another aspect of creating a stronger nation state was that Lincoln withdrew armies in the West in order to try to defend Washington, D.C. And that meant that these soldiers could not prevent conflicts between white settlers and Native Americans on the frontier, leading to much greater conflict and removal of Native American cultures, which allows for the nation state to expand, obviously at the expense of Native American cultures and their land. But for example, the Sand Creek massacre during the Sand Creek massacre, Colorado state troops killed about 400 Cheyenne and Arapaho men, women, and children in a terrible defeat for these tribes, which opened up a lot of land in modern day California to white settlement, something that probably would not have happened had federal troops been there to prevent such a conflict. Next, the Republican-led Congress passed a very high tariff to try to promote Northern industry. Again, typical Northern economic policy and part of the 1860 Republican platform. The Republican Congress also established a national banking system to at least temporarily provide a uniform national currency, which helped economically integrate the nation better than it had been. We also see greater integration of American citizens into mainstream society during the war. So, for example, women served in important roles during the war, especially in nursing, and this led to greater calls for suffrage. Although the women's rights movement had effectively been put on hold during the Civil War, but will come back effectively after the war is over with, again pushing for equal rights, especially the right to vote. Now, as I said before, not everyone in the North supported the war. Certainly, Copperheads or Northern Democrats advocated for peace rather than continuing the war. But there were also Northerners who opposed the war based on financial or economic justification. The best example of this are the New York City draft riots in 1863. These were massive riots over the course of days that broke out in New York City, so well into the north. And they broke out because of, well, the draft and that substitution fee. So many Northerners opposed the draft, especially immigrants, like Irish immigrants who didn't want to fight for African Americans because they thought freed slaves would move northward and challenge them for jobs. So we know that the draft itself was part of the reason because a lot of draft offices were attacked and destroyed during these riots. Also, that $300 draft substitution fee, remember, a rich man's war but a poor man's fight, was also a reason for these riots because we see class conflict here. Poor many immigrant rioters were attacking and looting wealthy neighborhoods and burning those homes because those were the people who could avoid going to war, who could get their children out of the war, whereas a lot of poor New Yorkers simply could not do that. And certainly racism was a cause of these riots as well. There was that fear of a status change for African Americans that might challenge white supremacy in some way. And we know this because white New Yorkers were attacking African American neighborhoods, institutions like churches and orphanages, and actually lynching African Americans in the streets from trees and lampposts and other things. Eventually, the Army and the Navy had to be called in to put these riots down. The Navy sailed into New York Harbor and bombarded the city with artillery, while Union troops marched through to reinstate order in the city. So, this is a pretty dramatic demonstration of Northern opposition to the war and the status change that it potentially offered African Americans. Finally, how did the war effort and leadership problems affect society and the society and economy of the Confederacy? So, President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, was ultimately unable to effectively lead because the Confederacy lacked the kind of centralized government that the North or the Union enjoyed. Their Confederacy, if you remember all the problems that the Articles of Confederation posed to the early United States, we see a lot of those same kinds of things here. So could not compel taxes, could not compel soldiers to or could not compel states to turn over a certain requisite number of troops and other things like that. Also, we know that King Cotton diplomacy was unsuccessful, especially after the Battle of Antietam persuaded Britain and France to stay out of the war. Furthermore, the Confederate draft was opposed as a violation of states' rights and of individual liberty. And yeoman farmers, which are most white Southerners, opposed the 20 Negro provision that exempted one white for every 20 slaves that they owned on that plantation. It favored the wealthy. Again, it's a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. So there is significant opposition to the draft. Furthermore, the Union blockade of the South, otherwise known as the Anaconda Plan, caused severe supply and food shortages, meaning that people back home were starving, people, or rather soldiers on the Confederate lines were starving, and it led to wholesale desertion from Confederate lines by the time the war was over. Number 5, what were the military and political turning points of the war? Again, we don't want to focus too intensely on these. So the only military action that you really need to know in the latter days of the war, and again, it probably won't be on the AP exam, is the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. Here, a second Confederate invasion of the North is defeated. There are massive casualties, and the Confederacy can do little more than retreat ever after this battle. And at this point, it's just a matter of time before they're forced to surrender because of casualties. A significant political turning point is going to be that Lincoln wins re-election in 1864, which was very much in question leading up to that election. Um, his victory was aided by the fall of Atlanta, a major southern city. So this is a major Union victory. It gave a lot of voters the perception that the end of the war was just around the corner, and persuaded many voters to maintain their support of Abraham Lincoln to continue and finish out the war. Number 6, what were the most important wartime rehearsals for Reconstruction? Reconstruction is a roughly decade-long period after the war concludes that sees the nation trying to reunite as a whole and to integrate freed slaves into white society, giving equal rights, the right to vote, and so on. But efforts to do these things have already begun before the war is even over. So for example, the Union Army experimented with new rights and a wage labor system for emancipated slaves. Uh, the Union Army in places confiscated plantation land, redistributing it to emancipated slaves. In particular, General Sherman's Special Field Order Number 15 set aside land in South Carolina and Georgia for freed slaves, promising each head of household 40 acres and a mule. They would never be given these things, and they would not get that land for the most part. But this was an experimentation in how to integrate this newly freed population into wider American society. And so again, these kinds of plans were typically abandoned after the war, and virtually all land was returned to their previous white owners. And what's really important about this, I think, is that it left a population of millions of freed slaves with no financial foundation whatsoever. They certainly don't have any money, and without land, they have an inability to build wealth. And that maintained a subordinate economic status for African Americans that will have incredibly or monumentally consequential effects even up into the modern day. Lincoln's rehearsal for Reconstruction was his proposed 10% plan in 1863. This was a plan to readmit Southern states and put the country back together. The 10% plan said that a state that had, like a Confederate state, they could re-enter the Union as soon as 10% of the number of voters from 1860 took a loyalty oath and agreed to abide by the emancipation of slaves. Pretty simple and pretty lenient toward the South, because Lincoln was seeking a quick reunification and reconciliation. He did not have any goals to fundamentally reshape the South in any other way than ending slavery, which is a pretty big deal. But he wanted the South to be able to re-enter the Union and reconcile as quickly as they possibly could. But for many radical Republicans in Congress, this was simply too lenient. So radical Republicans in Congress will counter this proposal with one of their own called the Wade-Davis Bill in 1864. Because they saw the 10% plan as too lenient, the Wade-Davis Bill said that a state could re-enter the Union as soon as 50% of the number of voters in 1860 took a loyalty oath. And not only did they have to agree to abide by emancipation, but they had to be granted equal rights under the law. This is much harder to accomplish. It is much stricter. It does not have any expectation of being quick or encouraging reconciliation for the South. And as a result, it's vetoed by Lincoln. But we're already seeing battle lines drawn between the executive branch or the president and the legislative branch or Congress over who is going to control the course of Reconstruction. And that is going to fundamentally affect what Reconstruction is going to look like. If it's in the president's hands, it'll probably be pretty lenient. If it is in Congress's hands, it'll probably be pretty punitive toward the South. Anyway, let's wrap up the war real quick. Sherman's march to the sea between 1864 and 65 is a big turning point for that. Um, General Sherman and his troops marched through the South, cutting an enormous swath of destruction with the intention of breaking the Confederate will to fight. Sherman's march burned and destroyed plantations, pulled up railroads, destroyed homes, razed cities, destroyed what manufacturing existed, and did a lot of infrastructural damage to southern states with the, again, intention of breaking their will to fight by bringing the war very close to home for them. The end of the war also sees the 13th Amendment passed by Congress and ratified by the states. Not Confederate states, they haven't re-entered yet. So these are northern states that are passing and ratifying the 13th Amendment, which abolishes the institution of slavery. So what the Emancipation Proclamation effectively promised to do, the 13th Amendment actually does. The Confederate States of America will surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia on April 9th, 1865, and this marks the end of the war itself. Lincoln, however, will only get to enjoy that for about 2 days, as he will be assassinated on April 11th, 1865, at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., by an actor and Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth. The effect of this is going to be that Lincoln's 10% plan and his attitude of reconciliation aren't going to happen. So Reconstruction with Lincoln's assassination looks to be something that will prove much more difficult. And we're going to continue to see this tug of war between the president and Congress over who will control Reconstruction and thus what it will look like. And it's going to be more contentious under Lincoln's vice president, who will now be President Andrew Johnson, than it might have otherwise been under Lincoln himself.